On April 22nd, 2026, while most of the tech world was busy watching the usual quantum computing headline grabbers, a comparatively quiet company most casual investors have probably never heard of picked up a fresh Defense Department contract, and almost nobody outside a small circle of specialists noticed at the time. No dramatic press conference, no 20% stock pop splashed across financial news. Just a $2 million award, quietly announced from one of the most secretive and most consequential research agencies inside the entire United States government. And the more you dig into why this specific company got picked, the more it tells you about where the real quantum computing race is actually heading, far away from the headlines everyone else is watching. Let's set the stage properly first, because context matters enormously here, and understanding exactly what happened in the days just before this quieter announcement makes the whole story considerably easier to appreciate. Just 8 days earlier, on April 14th, 2026, DARPA made an announcement that did generate exactly the kind of drama-like market reaction you would expect. IonQ, one of the most recognizable, most heavily covered, publicly traded quantum computing companies in the world, won a contract under a DARPA program called Heterogeneous, Architectures for Quantum, or HARK for short. IonQ's stock jumped more than 20% in a single trading day. Financial media outlets covered it extensively. Analysts rushed out updated price targets. It was, by every conventional measure, exactly the kind of headline grabbing when the entire quantum computing sector lives for. But here is the detail that almost completely slipped past mainstream financial coverage entirely, buried underneath a much louder, much more heavily covered story from just over a week earlier. Just over a week later, that same HARK program quietly handed out another award, this time to a company called Inflection. And the contrast between how these two announcements were received tells you almost everything you need to know about how differently the market treats the famous names versus the companies actually doing some of the most technically interesting work in the entire field. Inflection's contract was smaller in dollar terms, roughly $2 million, considerably less than the kind of headline figures that move stock prices dramatically. But dismissing it purely because of that dollar figure would be a genuine mistake. And understanding exactly why requires digging into what Inflection actually does, and why DARPA specifically wanted a company like this one involved in this particular program. Let's talk about the HARK program itself first, because understanding its actual goal explains why DARPA needed more than just one famous headline-grabbing company involved to make the overall effort genuinely work. Heterogeneous Architectures for Quantum is built around a genuinely fascinating and somewhat under-discussed problem in the quantum computing field. For years, the industry conversation has largely centered on a single question, which individual qubit technology will eventually win. Trapped ions, superconducting circuits, neutral atoms, photonics, or something else entirely. HARK approaches the problem from a fundamentally different angle, asking whether the actual future of quantum computing might not be a single winning architecture at all, but rather a network of different quantum systems, each excelling at different specific tasks, working together as one larger, combined computational system. The same way modern classical computers already combine different specialized chips, a general processor here, a graphics processor there, specialized memory modules elsewhere, into one unified, more capable overall machine. That framing matters enormously for understanding why Inflection specifically caught DARPA's attention. The contract specifically supports development of something called multistack, a platform designed to help genuinely different types of quantum hardware, built on entirely different underlying physics, actually communicate and work together within one larger heterogeneous system. If the future of quantum computing genuinely does involve stitching together multiple different physical qubit technologies rather than betting everything on a single winning approach, then the company that builds the connective infrastructure making that combination actually possible becomes just as strategically important as any individual hardware manufacturer. Arguably even more so, because that connective layer would end up sitting underneath every single combination of quantum hardware built on top of it. If you're starting to see why this quiet, comparatively small contract might matter more than its modest dollar figure initially suggests, that is exactly the point of this video. So go ahead and tap that like button right now if you are finding this breakdown useful, because it genuinely helps this channel keep digging past the obvious headlines to find the stories that actually matter. Let's talk about Inflection itself, because understanding the company's actual background helps explain exactly why DARPA saw it as a genuinely credible partner for this specific, technically demanding task, rather than simply a smaller, less impressive alternative to the bigger names everyone already knows. Inflection, based out of Chicago with significant operations in Boulder, Colorado, has built its entire technical foundation around neutral atom technology, an approach that uses individual electrically neutral atoms trapped and precisely manipulated using finely tuned laser light. This happens to be the exact same broad category of quantum technology that companies like Atom Computing and Quera Computing are pursuing as well. And if that name Quera sounds familiar, it should, because it was one of the 11 companies that survived all the way into Stage B of DARPA's much larger, much more heavily covered quantum benchmarking initiative that we have discussed in previous videos on this channel. Here is what genuinely sets Inflection apart from a lot of its neutral atom competitors, and it is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when coverage focuses purely on stock price movements rather than actual underlying technical capability. The company does not just build quantum computers, it also builds quantum sensing technology, using that same fundamental neutral atom expertise to create instruments capable of measuring things like gravity, magnetic fields, and precise timing with a level of accuracy that classical instruments simply cannot match. That dual expertise, spanning both quantum computing and quantum sensing, built on the exact same underlying atomic physics, is precisely the kind of broad, deep, cross-disciplinary technical foundation that makes a company genuinely well-suited to tackle a problem as ambitious and as technically demanding as building the connective software and hardware infrastructure needed to link fundamentally different quantum systems together into one working, heterogeneous whole. Let's dig a little deeper into that quantum sensing side of Inflection's business, because I think it genuinely helps explain why DARPA specifically values this particular company's broad technical foundation, rather than viewing it as simply a smaller, less capable alternative to the bigger quantum computing names everyone already recognizes. Quantum sensors built around neutral atom technology can measure incredibly subtle changes in gravity, acceleration, and magnetic fields with a level of precision that classical instruments simply cannot approach. And that capability has genuinely significant applications well beyond pure scientific curiosity. Militaries and defense applications include navigation systems that do not depend on GPS satellites, which could potentially be jammed or disabled during an actual conflict, along with the ability to detect submarines, underground structures, or other hidden objects by measuring the incredibly subtle gravitational or magnetic disturbances they create in their surrounding environment. This dual expertise matters enormously for a program like HARK specifically, because building genuinely reliable connective infrastructure between different quantum computing architectures requires exactly the kind of extraordinarily precise timing, synchronization, and control expertise that quantum sensing work naturally develops. A company that has already spent years building instruments capable of measuring physical phenomena with almost unimaginable precision has, in the process, also built up exactly the kind of deep, practical expertise in controlling and synchronizing extraordinarily sensitive quantum systems that turns out to be directly relevant to the completely separate seeming challenge of linking different quantum computing architectures together reliably. That kind of technical crossover, expertise developed in one specific application area, turning out to be directly useful in a seemingly unrelated one, is exactly the sort of thing that a purely surface-level analysis focused only on which companies build the flashiest quantum computers would completely miss. It is also worth understanding the broader defense context surrounding why DARPA cares this much about quantum sensing capabilities specifically, beyond just the computing angle we have already spent most of this video discussing. Reports have suggested that military planners around the world have become increasingly concerned about the vulnerability of GPS-dependent navigation and timing systems to jamming, spoofing, and other forms of electronic warfare during any potential future conflict. Quantum sensors, precisely because they rely on fundamental physical constants and atomic properties rather than external satellite signals that can be disrupted or faked, offer a genuinely compelling alternative source of extraordinarily precise navigation and timing information that does not depend on any external signal that an adversary might be able to interfere with. A company like Inflection, bringing genuine, demonstrated expertise in exactly this kind of quantum sensing technology to a program focused on connecting different quantum computing architectures together, represents exactly the kind of broad, cross-disciplinary, technical value that a narrower company focused purely on one single application would simply not be able to offer. Let's also talk about Chicago's growing role in the broader quantum computing ecosystem, because Inflection's location is not simply an incidental detail. It reflects a genuinely significant, somewhat under-discussed shift in where serious quantum computing research and development has increasingly been concentrating within the United States. While Silicon Valley and Boston remain the most heavily covered technology hubs in most mainstream coverage, Chicago has quietly built a genuinely serious quantum computing cluster over the past several years, anchored partly around major research institutions and a deliberate, coordinated effort by regional economic development organizations to attract and retain quantum computing talent and investment. The Chicago Quantum Exchange, a regional research consortium, Bringing together several major universities and national laboratories has played a significant role in that broader effort, and Inflection's continued growth and success as a Chicago-based company reflects at least part of that broader regional momentum. This geographic dimension matters for understanding the full picture here, because it is a genuine reminder that the quantum computing industry, despite so much mainstream coverage focusing overwhelmingly on a small handful of famous, publicly traded companies concentrated in a couple of well-known coastal tech hubs, is actually considerably more geographically distributed and considerably more diverse than most casual observers probably realize. Meaningful, technically serious quantum computing work is happening in research. Clusters across the country, sometimes in cities that do not immediately come to mind when people think about cutting-edge technology development, and companies emerging from those less heavily covered regional clusters occasionally end up picking up exactly the kind of quietly significant government contracts we have spent this entire video discussing. Now, let's talk about why this particular story genuinely deserves to be framed as nobody expected it, because I do not want to oversell the surprise angle without actually justifying it properly. Inflection has, in fairness, been quietly building genuine credibility within government and defense circles for several years now, so calling this contract a complete, out-of-nowhere shock would be overstating things. But relative to the household names that dominate almost every quantum computing headline, companies like IBM, Google, IonQ, and Quantinuum, Inflection remains considerably less visible to ordinary retail investors and casual technology news consumers, precisely because it has never gone public through a traditional stock listing the way several of its more heavily covered competitors have. No public stock ticker means no dramatic single-day stock price. Swings for financial media to write breathless headlines about, which means genuinely important, technically significant news about the company tends to slip through the cracks of mainstream coverage entirely, exactly the way this particular contract did. This is actually a genuinely important, broader lesson about how to follow the quantum computing industry intelligently, rather than just reactively, and it is worth pausing on before we go further. A huge amount of financial media coverage of quantum computing is driven almost entirely by which companies happen to be publicly traded, because publicly traded companies generate stock price movements, and stock price movements generate clicks, and clicks generate advertising revenue for financial news outlets. That incentive structure means some of the most technically interesting, most strategically significant developments in the entire quantum computing field happen at privately held companies that never generate a single dramatic headline, simply because there's no ticker symbol attached to the story for anyone to write breathlessly about. If this kind of deep dive into stories that slip past mainstream coverage is useful to you, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because we are going to keep digging specifically into the quantum computing developments that do not generate flashy stock price headlines, but genuinely matter for where this entire field is actually heading. Let's zoom out and talk about why DARPA specifically cares about heterogeneous quantum architecture in the first place, because understanding the strategic think-in-G behind the entire HARK program helps explain why a company like Inflection fits so naturally into it. We have talked at length in previous videos on this channel about DARPA's much larger quantum benchmarking initiative, the program specifically designed to determine whether any single quantum computing approach can reach genuine utility scale operation by 2033. HARK represents a complementary, in some ways more pragmatic bet, an acknowledgement that even if no single quantum architecture ends up dominating the field, the way classical silicon-based computing eventually came to dominate its own era, a combination of multiple different complementary quantum technologies working together might still be able to deliver genuine practical value considerably sooner than waiting for one single unified approach to fully mature on its own. This is not a purely theoretical concern either. Different qubit technologies genuinely do have wildly different strengths and weaknesses that make combining them, at least in theory, a genuinely compelling strategy. Superconducting qubits, the kind IBM and Google have generally favored, tend to offer fast operation speeds, but typically require extremely challenging, expensive cryogenic cooling infrastructure. Trapped ion systems, the approach favored by companies like IonQ and Quantinuum, tend to offer exceptionally high accuracy and quality of individual operations, but have historically faced more significant challenges scaling up to very large numbers of qubits. Neutral atom systems, Inflection's own specialty alongside companies like Quera and Atom Computing, offer a genuinely appealing combination of scalability and flexibility, since researchers can dynamically rearrange the physical layout of trapped atoms in ways that other architectures generally cannot easily replicate. If you could genuinely combine the raw speed advantages of superconducting systems, the exceptional operational accuracy of trapped ion systems, and the scalability and flexibility of neutral atom systems into one single cooperating heterogeneous computational platform, You would theoretically end up with a combined system considerably more capable than any single one of those individual approaches could achieve entirely on its own. That is precisely the strategic bet underlying the entire HARK program, and it is exactly why DARPA needed to fund companies working specifically on the connective infrastructure problem, not just companies building yet another individual, isolated qubit technology, competing purely on its own separate merits. Let's also talk briefly about a related, genuinely interesting contrast worth mentioning here, because it adds important context to this entire story about DARPA's funding decisions not always following the most obvious, most predictable pattern. Rigetti Computing, another publicly traded, reasonably well-known quantum computing company, was actually part of DARPA's original Larger 15 company Stage A cohort for the separate Quantum Benchmarking Initiative program, but did not make the cut when DARPA selected its 11 companies for Stage B. That is a genuinely significant signal in its own right, a reminder that DARPA's evaluation process across all of its various quantum computing programs is not simply rewarding whichever company happens to have the most recognizable public brand or the loudest marketing presence. Companies with considerably higher public name recognition than Inflection have been passed over at various stages of these evaluation processes, while considerably less famous companies like Inflection have continued quietly picking up genuinely meaningful government contracts, precisely because DARPA's evaluation criteria are built around underlying technical substance rather than public visibility or stock market attention. That pattern, DARPA rewarding genuine technical substance over public recognition, should tell you something important about how to actually evaluate quantum computing companies going forward, whether you're approaching this purely out of curiosity or with some kind of investment angle in mind. Stock price reactions and mainstream media coverage measure public attention and market sentiment, which absolutely matter in their own right, but they do not necessarily measure underlying technical credibility or genuine strategic importance within the broader quantum computing ecosystem. Government funding decisions, particularly from an organization as historically rigorous and technically sophisticated as DARPA, arguably offer a considerably more reliable signal of genuine technical substance. Precisely because the evaluators involved have no financial stake riding on hyping up whichever company happens to be trendiest in a given news cycle. Let's talk about what happens next for this specific multistack platform, and more broadly for the entire heterogeneous quantum computing approach that HARK represents, because understanding the trajectory here matters just as much as understanding the initial contract announcement itself. This particular award represents an early stage contract, not a finished, fully deployed product ready for immediate widespread use. Building genuinely reliable, genuinely useful software and hardware infrastructure capable of linking fundamentally different quantum systems together, systems built on entirely different underlying physics, operating according to entirely different timing and control requirements, represents a genuinely difficult multi-year engineering challenge in its own right, layered directly on top of all the existing challenges each individual quantum hardware approach already faces entirely on its own. But if this specific approach does eventually prove successful, the implications extend considerably beyond just Inflection's own. Individual business prospects. A genuinely working, genuinely reliable, heterogeneous quantum architecture would fundamentally reshape how the entire industry thinks about hardware development going forward. Instead of individual companies racing to build one single, complete, self-sufficient quantum computer entirely from scratch, using only their own preferred qubit technology throughout the entire system, the field could gradually shift toward companies specializing in specific components of a larger, combined, interoperable quantum ecosystem. The same fundamental pattern that has already played out across the broader history of classical computing, where different specialized companies build processors, memory chips, storage systems, and networking hardware separately, all designed from the ground up to interoperate smoothly within one larger, combined computing environment. That shift, if it genuinely does happen over the coming years, would represent a considerably more collaborative, considerably less winner, take-all vision for how quantum computing ultimately matures into a genuinely practical, widely deployed technology, compared to the more commonly discussed narrative of a single dominant qubit technology, eventually emerging triumphant while every competing approach quietly fade us away into irrelevance. It is a genuinely different, in some ways considerably more optimistic vision for the field's future, one where companies pursuing entirely different underlying physical approaches to quantum computing do not necessarily have to be viewed as competitors racing toward the exact same finish line, but potentially as complementary pieces of one larger, more capable, combined system still waiting to be properly assembled. Let's widen the lens even further, because Inflection is far from the only example of this exact pattern playing out across the broader quantum computing industry, and understanding that broader pattern genuinely changes how you should think about following this entire sector going forward. Rigetti Computing, mentioned earlier for missing the cut on the larger quantum benchmarking initiative, still managed to secure a separate, considerably smaller contract with the Air Force Research Lab, around the same general period, specifically focused on quantum networking, rather than the broader utility-scale computing goal that program emphasizes. IonQ, despite already being the headline-grabbing story of this entire video's opening section, also quietly signed a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Energy, specifically covering space-related quantum applications, a genuinely interesting angle that received considerably less coverage than the HARK contract announcement that dominated financial headlines that same week. This pattern major, well-known companies generating dramatic headlines for their most visible contracts, while simultaneously picking up a whole additional layer of smaller, quieter government partnerships that barely register with mainstream financial coverage, tells you something important about how deeply embedded government funding has become across this entire industry, considerably beyond what a casual observer scanning stock market headlines would ever realize. For companies still years away from generating meaningful, sustainable commercial revenue on their own, precisely the situation every single quantum computing company currently finds itself in, regardless of size or public profile. These government contracts represent something considerably more valuable than just the dollar figures attached to them. They represent an ongoing, continuously updated signal of exactly which specific technical approaches and which specific companies the most rigorous, most technically sophisticated evaluators currently available anywhere in the country genuinely believe are worth taking seriously. Let's talk about why this matters specifically for anyone trying to actually understand or invest intelligently in this sector, rather than simply reacting to whichever quantum computing headline happens to be trending on a given day. A genuinely sophisticated approach to following this industry involves tracking not just the dramatic market-moving announcements from the handful of publicly traded companies that dominate mainstream coverage, but also the quieter, considerably less publicized contracts flowing toward privately held companies that never generate the same kind of dramatic stock price reaction, simply because there is no public stock price for that reaction to move. There is also a genuinely important lesson here about patience and thoroughness that extends well beyond quantum computing specifically, into how anyone should approach following any complex, rapidly evolving technology sector. The loudest, most widely covered story in any given news cycle is not automatically the most important or the most technically significant one. It is simply the story that happened to generate the most attention, for reasons that often have more to do with existing public name recognition, stock market dynamics, and media incentive structures than with genuine underlying technical substance. Developing the habit of actively looking past the loudest headline toward the quieter, less publicized developments happening in parallel is exactly the kind of skill that consistently pays off across any fast-moving, technically complex industry, whether that industry happens to be quantum computing, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, or virtually any other frontier technology field currently attracting significant public and private investment. Let's bring this back around to multistack specifically one more time, because I think it is worth spending a little more time understanding exactly what success would actually look like for this specific platform, since that concrete picture makes the whole story feel considerably less abstract. Imagine a future computing environment where a specific calculation needs the exceptional operational accuracy that trapped ion systems currently offer for one particular stage of the process, then needs to hand that intermediate result off to a superconducting system optimized for raw processing speed for a different stage, before finally routing the result through a neutral atom system specifically optimized for the kind of flexible, dynamically reconfigurable connectivity that stage of the calculation happens to require. Making that kind of seamless handoff between fundamentally different physical systems actually work reliably without losing multistack is specifically designed to solve. If Inflection and its collaborators on this specific contract manage to make genuine progress on that challenge over the coming months and years, the resulting technology would not simply benefit Inflection's own individual business prospects, it would potentially provide foundational, broadly applicable infrastructure that an enormous range of different quantum hardware companies across the entire industry could eventually build on top of, regardless of which specific individual qubit technology any particular company happens to be pursuing on its own. That kind of foundational, broadly applicable infrastructure work rarely generates the same dramatic headlines as an individual company's flashy new processor announcement, but it can end up mattering considerably more for the industry's overall long-term trajectory, precisely because foundational infrastructure tends to quietly become load-bearing for an enormous number of downstream applications built on top of it, well after the original announcement introducing it has been completely forgotten by everyone except the specialists still actively working with it every single day. There's also something worth appreciating about DARPA's own institutional approach here, distinct from anything specific to Inflection itself. The agency has a decades-long track record of funding genuinely foundational, unglamorous infrastructure work well before that work becomes commercially obvious or immediately profitable, precisely because government research funding operates on a fundamentally ecosystem broadly, not just the individual company that happened to receive the original contract. That distinction helps explain why a contract like this one, quiet, comparatively modest in dollar terms, focused on unglamorous connective infrastructure rather than a flashy new processor announcement, fits so naturally into DARPA's own historical pattern of funding decisions, even though it looks so different from the kind of quantum computing news that typically generates mainstream attention. Understanding that pattern is genuinely useful context for interpreting future DARPA announcements as well, since it suggests the agency will likely keep making exactly this kind of quiet, foundational bet across other under-the-radar companies working on similarly unglamorous but genuinely important infrastructure problems throughout the broader quantum computing ecosystem in the years ahead. But that's not even the biggest surprise buried in the summer of 2026. 9 days after that fusion research made headlines, something even less expected happened in Washington. The White House convened a quantum computing summit, and nearly every major quantum company in the country had a seat at the table. Chief executives, founders, the researchers whose names sit on the foundational papers. Not a conference, not an industry mixer, a federal summit, treating quantum computing the way past administrations once treated the space race or the early internet, as a technology the government itself intends to help build a market for, not just regulate from a distance. Now understand why that matters, because governments, by their very nature, cautious. Let that land for a moment, because the reasoning behind it is not new. It is one of the oldest patterns in American technological history. The government has always been the first buyer of technologies too early and too expensive for anyone else to justify purchasing. Radar, the nuclear age, the satellite constellations, and the positioning, systems that now sit quietly inside every phone on Earth. In every one of those cases, the first government purchase happened before a commercial market existed at all, and that purchase is exactly what created the market that came afterward. The same logic is now being applied deliberately and explicitly to quantum computing. The government intends to be the first buyer of quantum-safe cryptography, quantum sensing, and quantum computing itself, with the expectation that private industry follows the same way it always has, once the first customer proves the technology is worth building around. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about, because it complicates the excitement instead of feeding it. The people closest to this technology, the ones sitting in that summit room, did not oversell what they had built. Asked what would define quantum computing over the next 5 to 10 years, the founders and executives in the room did not describe a machine replacing the computer on your desk. They described something closer to a specialized partner sitting beside classical computing and artificial intelligence, handling a narrow set of problems where it holds a genuine advantage, and leaving everything else to the machines already doing that work well. Nobody in that room claimed a single quantum computer was about to replace the classical infrastructure running a major city. And notably, the industry ranked quantum sensing, not quantum computing, as the technology likely to reach practical maturity first, with an example that stuck with everyone in attendance. A quantum sensor allowing an aircraft to navigate accurately without depending on a satellite signal that an adversary could jam or spoof entirely. Modern navigation for ships, aircraft, and even ordinary vehicles increasingly leans on satellite positioning, and that dependence is a known vulnerability, one that hostile actors have already demonstrated they can exploit through jamming and spoofing in contested regions. A quantum sensor solves that problem at the level of physics itself, measuring motion and orientation with such precision that it does not need an outside signal at all. That is not a distant sci-fi promise. That is a capability defense planners are treating as arriving inside this decade, and one that could quietly end up inside commercial aviation navigation systems long before most passengers ever hear the word quantum associated with their flight. Now let's talk about what is still broken, because a serious account of this story has to include it. The same summit spent real time on the unresolved problems sitting underneath all the momentum. The algorithms remain ahead of the hardware. Researchers openly admit there are not yet enough proven quantum algorithms to make a 2028-era machine worth building for a problem of genuine national or economic weight. There is a certification problem baked into the core promise of quantum computing itself. If you build a machine specifically to solve a problem too complex for any classical computer to check the answer against, how do you actually prove the answer it gives you is correct? Right now, there is no fully agreed method, and there is a standards problem layered on top of that. The field still lacks a shared, trusted way to distinguish a genuine computational demonstration from a carefully staged one, which means the entire ecosystem is currently running, in part, on reputation and trust rather than independently verifiable proof. The certification problem deserves a moment of its own, because it cuts against the entire premise of why quantum computers are exciting in the first place. The whole point of building a machine this expensive and this difficult is to eventually solve problems too complex for any classical computer to handle. But that same complexity means that once the quantum computer produces an answer, there is often no independent classical method left to double-check that answer against, because if there were, you would not have needed the quantum computer in the first place. Researchers are actively working on cryptographic and statistical techniques that let you verify a quantum result without redoing the entire calculation classically. But those verification methods are, themselves, still an open area of research, not a solved problem sitting quietly in the background. Until that gap closes, every headline-grabbing quantum result carries an asterisk that rarely makes it into the headline itself, an asterisk. That says, in effect, trust the process because nobody can fully check the answer yet. But that's not even the worst part. Beneath all of it sits a quieter worry that industry insiders describe as the real risk to the entire timeline, the supply chain. Building a quantum computer is not just a physics problem. It requires an entire manufacturing ecosystem, specialized lasers, ultra-precise fabrication equipment, cryogenic systems capable of reaching temperatures colder than deep space, and components that, in many cases, only a handful of suppliers on Earth can produce at the required precision. Fund the flashy top of that stack, the chips and the algorithms and the headline-grabbing demonstrations, and assume the unglamorous suppliers underneath will simply appear when needed, and you will be wrong. That enabling layer does not build itself, and multiple people at the highest levels of this industry now say so directly and without spin. But